was a brilliant innings. Couldn't have asked for much more than what he did.
When the West Indies last visited Australia 4 years ago, they came from behind to win the series 2-1. The defining moment of the tour came at Sydney in the third test, when facing a first innings total of over 500, they were 2 for 31 before Brian Lara announced himself in no uncertain fashion with 277. That guaranteed a draw, and the West Indies went on to win the fourth test by a run and the fifth rather more convincingly.
That was the one thing that I really wanted to achieve, was a series win against the West Indies. And it was so close yet so far. We held the advantage 1-0 going into Adelaide, and for the sake of a couple of runs, could have made it 2-0 going into the Perth game.
It was the greatest disappointment of Alan Border's distinguished career, and not long after his international retirement, the Australians did what no one had been able to do for 15 years and 29 series, defeat the West Indies, and they did it in their own backyard by 2 tests to 1. It was a series not without acrimony, as the West Indies were outthought and outbattered, particularly by Steve Waugh, who averaged over 100 for the 4-test series. An indifferent start to this tour had left the West Indies short of confidence approaching the first test. But the Australians were also under pressure, having lost every international match in their tour to India, and their most consistent worry centred on Shane Warne, back after a lengthy layoff following surgery to his spinning finger. For much of the first day, the West Indies held the upper hand. Shortly after tea, Australia were 5 for 195, a virtually identical position to the first test of the Caribbean series 20 months previously. On that occasion, the Australians were rescued by Ian Healy and Steve Waugh. History was to repeat itself here in Brisbane, but rather more emphatically. Courtney Walsh had won the toss, and to the satisfaction of both sides, put the Australians in. New opening batsman Matthew Elliott, who had scored a big 100 in Australia A's victory over the tourists, went early. And for the rest of the morning, the Australians struggled, particularly Taylor, who went into lunch on 19. Ricky Ponting, 56 of the break, was the much more assured of the pair and seemed destined for a maiden test century. But on 88, he missed time to pull shot to leave Australia on 3 for 146. The Waugh brothers put on exactly 50 before Mark, pulling at a leg stump delivery from Walsh, was well caught by Brown. Bevan lasted just one ball, which brought Ian Healy to the crease. By close of play, Australia had recovered to 5 for 282, with Steve Waugh on 48 and Ian Healy on 47. Both passed 50 during a tense first hour the following morning, which yielded only 23 runs. Waugh failed to survive the session and fell with the score on 338.
Finally, the change of angle gets the wicket.
The West Indies of old would have been expected to wrap up the innings, but for the 5th time in their last 6 tests, they conceded a score in excess of 400 as Healy continued his dogged stay. His magnificent 161 not out was a record for an Australian stumper, and with valuable support from Rifle and Warne, Australia reached 479, nearly 300 on from that first day position of 5 for 196. By the 8th over of the following day, the West Indies were in trouble. 3 down for 77, without a form Brian Lara back in the pavilion. Chandrapal yet to score, very nearly rewarded Warne with his first wicket on return, but an agile foot saved the day. Thereafter, he and Carl Hooper enjoyed the best partnership of the test, putting on 172 for the 4th wicket and taking the West Indies to within 30 of avoiding the follow-on. Both were particularly punishing on Warne. Hooper reached his 6th test century, but then fell to a brilliant Ricky Ponting catch, which turned the match. When Steve Waugh was unable to complete his 9th over, Ponting took over, and 5 balls later had Jimmy Adams legged before for a duck. Chandrapal fell shortly afterwards for 88, and 10 runs later the West Indies were all out for 277, 3 short of the follow-on target. 7 wickets had fallen in 12 overs for only 28 runs. Just as he did against England at Brisbane 2 years ago, Taylor didn't enforce the follow-on, and once again it paid off. On a slowing pitch, the Australians declared on 6 for 217, with Mark Waugh, the only batsman past 50, and Ian Healy taking his aggregate for the test at 206 without dismissal. By close of play and after 29 overs, the West Indies had reached 1 for 89, with Sherwin Campbell and Brian Lara at the crease. The avowed intention was to go for the 331 runs needed on the final day, but 14 overs later, the game plan looked lost, as Lara departed for 44. Hooper's departure, the first of Bevan's 3 wickets, and when Chandra, Paul and Adams went, with the score just past 200, the Australians looked set for an easy win. But Campbell continued to defy them and with some support from Brown and Bishop took the match into the final hour. Bevan eventually broke his resistance and the Australians won by 123 runs. For the 10th successive innings, the West Indies failed to pass 300 against the Aussies, and with Lara out of form, the sequence didn't look likely to be broken when the teams met at Sydney 3 days later. Once again, the West Indies bowled themselves into a strong position after Mark Taylor won the toss and elected to bat. Initially comfortable at 54 for no wicket, the Australians then lost 4 for 40, Bishop and Walsh taking 2 apiece. Greg Blewett, drafted in to replace the injured Steve Waugh, played the innings of the day and found a likely ally in Ian Healy. Both fell to Walsh the following morning, Healy for 44 and Blewett 69, to leave Australia on 7 for 245. Once again, the West Indies couldn't subdue the tail. The remainder all chipped in and Glenn McGrath, a genuine number 11, scored his highest first-class score of 24 in a last-wicket partnership worth 43. By close of play on the second day, the match was delicately poised with the West Indies on 3 for 151. Sherwin Campbell maintained his form of 5 days previously, and with fellow opener Robert Samuels put on 92 for the first wicket. This was the West Indies' best start in 26 tests. Samuels was first to go for 35, LBW to McGrath, and it was he who accounted for Lara shortly afterwards. Once again, Taylor used a part-time bowler for a key dismissal. Blewett reverse swinging a Yorker to dismiss Campbell for 77. Day 3 and much would depend on the trio of Hooper, Chandra, Paul and Adams. But Hooper fell early to Warne and then a double breakthrough with the score on 229. 15 runs later and the last of the resistance appeared to be over when after 3 1/4 hours at the crease, Chandra Paul was deceived by Warne, too short of his 50. But Bishop batted as well as anyone on this wicket in making his highest test score, and when he was last out for 48, the West Indies were only 19 shy of Australia's total. They also thought they'd got off to the perfect start, and their confidence must have been further undermined when Taylor refused an offer for bad light with the score on 18. By the close, they were 2 for 77, with both wickets falling to the man of the day, Ian Bishop. Australia may have just had their noses in front by the start of day 4, but by mid-afternoon they were well on top, thanks to the generosity of the West Indies. Their bowling may have been restrictive early on, but the fielding was an embarrassment. Catches went down and misfields abounded. One incident, 10 minutes before lunch, summed up the day. Mark Waugh and Matthew Elliott, going for a second run, had their eyes on the fielder when both changed course at the same moment. Hooper could have walked back to his end and still run out Waugh, but elected to hurl the ball back to Brown and failed to beat Elliott's heroic dive. The sad conclusion to the whole episode was that Elliott, 22 short of a maiden century, tore a cartilage in his right knee and could take no further part in this or the subsequent test. Waugh took full advantage of his reprieve and went on to make 67 and Australia's total of 4 for 312 declared. The match appeared to be as good as over within a half hour of the restart of the 5th day, as the West Indies lost 3 wickets with only 35 on the board.
Oh, and he's gone right through him. Samuels going back and trying to force Warne through the covers.
Lara was convinced the ball hadn't carried to Healy, and off the field made his feelings known to the Australians.
Hits the little finger and then goes into the palm of the right hand.
The Guyanese partnership of Hooper and Chandra Paul then played some of the best cricket of the match, scoring 117 in 22 overs. Then within 10 minutes to go before lunch, Warne returned and produced the sort of delivery that has made his reputation and strips batsmen of any confidence. 2.5 hours and 63 runs later, the match was over. Warne picked up another 2, Bevan and Taylor accounted for Hooper, and McGrath once again was the bedrock for an impressive Australian performance. He and Warne took 7 apiece in the match, but it was that one delivery that looked likely to have a lasting effect.
I always felt with blokes like Warney and Michael Bevan on that sort of wicket that you're always going to create a chance, and just needed to take that chance when it came along. And fortunately, Warney, the second last ball before lunch was the difference in the game.
This one hurts, I think, a lot more than in Brisbane, which is good to see the guys being disappointed. It means that they care, and you know, we're going to sit back and have a rethink when everyone's mind is clear.
The West Indies must have cleared their minds because 23 days later at Melbourne on Boxing Day, they looked a different side. Improved fielding and a rejuvenated Ambrose reduced Australia to 4 for 27 in front of the MCG's largest Test match crowd for 25 years. Matthew Hayden, prodigious at state level but yet to do it at Test, went to a great catch by Carl Hooper.
Superb bowling.
A still out of form Mark Taylor was bowled off his body, and then Mark Waugh set up Ambrose for the hat-trick ball, which brother Steve survived. But he was then found guilty for the dismissal of Justin Langer, who had been preferred to Ricky Ponting.
Oh, Waugh is not... He's left Justin Langer for dead.
Surely the West Indies wouldn't let this opportunity slip, but their nemesis, Steve Waugh, after seeing off Ambrose, showed typical resistance, and supported by Greg Blewett, who increasingly looks likely to represent Australia this summer and not Middlesex, the pair steered Australia past 100. After Waugh's departure for 58 with a score on 129, Healy continued the revival, and even with his dismissal, with a total 5 short of 200, the Australians on past form would probably still have fancied a total 300. But Blewett tried to farm the bowling with fatal results, and the Australians were dismissed for 219, leaving the West Indies to face a tricky 13 overs, which they negotiated for the loss of Campbell. Runs were hard to come by early on the second day. They may have accounted for Samuel's lapse when Warne was introduced with the score on 62. If the West Indies were to make the most of their fine first day, they needed a big one from Lara. Yet again he failed to deliver. Yet again he fell to McGrath for the 4th time in 5 Test innings. It was to be the New South Wales man's day, as 9 runs later his pick-up encountered for Hooper.
Oh, that's got to be out. Yes, he's got him. That's all over. I reckon he's out.
And then he pulled off a stunning one-hander return to dismiss Chandra Paul for yet another score past 50. His 11th in 14 tests. 5 for 107. And the initiative was back with the Australians. But for once, the West Indies' 6th wicket showed some resistance as Junior Murray and Jimmy Adams took the tourists to within 22 of a first innings lead. Murray chanced his way past 50 before becoming Test victim number 97 for McGrath, and Bishop was another shortly afterwards. Adams reached 50 and the West Indies 233 by close, 14 ahead with 1 wicket remaining. That 14 became an irritating 36 before Walsh succumbed to Warne, leaving Adams undefeated on 74. With the pitch becoming increasingly difficult for batsmen, the odds would still have favoured the Australians, but Curtly Ambrose, despite a hamstring problem, was at his most menacing. The inexperienced Hayden and Langer were no match for him, and once again Ambrose inspired Australian top order collapse. This time the top 4 managed 20 more than in the first innings, but from 4 for 47 there was to be no revival. Steve Waugh top scored with 37 as Walsh and Benjamin both claimed 3 apiece. But it was Ambrose who had been most telling with 4 for 17 off only 12 overs, and thus joining Lance Gibbs and Richard Hadley as the only non-English bowlers to take 100 Aussie wickets.
That's the question he's given him.
Needing just 87 for victory, the West Indies reached their target despite early wickets for McGrath. Yet again he accounted for Lara, who was averaging just 13 for the series and more alarmingly had scored just 7 in his last 4 Test innings. This was a crucial win for the West Indies, and it sets up what could be a thrilling finale.
Yes, it was nice to have one finally. We lost the first 2 and things were looking a little bit dicey, and it was very, very important for us to win this one to still have a chance of winning the series.
I think if we'd have made 250 to 300, we might have been just in.
And then, by the enforced absence of Curtly Ambrose, match winner in Melbourne, and for so long the dynamo of the West Indies team, Ambrose had been hobbled by a Wacker Younis blow to his right thigh while batting in the second final, and was found to be not up to the requirements of a crucial test on the morning of the match. His loss, and that of Kenny Benjamin, another of the fast bowling quartet whose tour was ended by a side strain, influenced Courtney Walsh into the unusual decision to bat on winning the toss. By tea, the match had been virtually settled, as the West Indies collapsed to be all out for 130 on a blameless pitch, a crisis from which they never looked like recovering. The lively McGrath removed Campbell without scoring, and Australia's debutant Andy Bickle accounted for his nervous West Indian counterpart, the left-handed Adrian Griffith, LBW, after which the contrasting wrist spin of Warne and Bevan destroyed the feeble opposition. The most crucial wicket was that of Brian Lara, who came into the match with 200s and a 90 in the World Series matches in the previous fortnight, only to lash out recklessly at the very first ball he faced from Warne, dragging a catch to mid-on. Warne also accounted for the left-handers Chandapol and Adams. Hooper could only fend a wicked lifter from McGrath into the slips, and the left-arm Bevan cleaned up the low order with his googly and with the assistance of the impeccable Healy. Although Captain Taylor again went cheaply to Bishop, and Langer fell to Cameron Cuffey, the replacement flown in a week earlier for Benjamin, Australia were already in front by the end of play. Aided by West Indian cricket that manager Clive Lloyd described as a horror story, the home team piled on the agony on the second day, appropriately Australia Day. No balls negated 3 dismissals, each to prove expensive. Hayden cut Walsh to point before he had added to his overnight 66. Blewett edged Walsh to Hooper at second slip when he was 14, and Bevan chopped Bishop into his stumps when he was 11. The uncertain Murray dropped Hayden at 83 off Walsh and missed a stumping from Hooper when Bevan was 8, while Walsh embarrassingly muffed a skied sit-off Cuffey when Blewett was 52. Hayden and Mark Waugh added 164 for the third wicket before Murray's juggle catch off Hooper accounted for Waugh for 82. By then, Hayden had passed his maiden 100 in his third test, and he went on to 125 before he too fell to the Hooper-Murray combination, a stumping victim as he attempted a second 6 off the off-spinner. When Hooper snared a spectacular catch at cover to account for Steve Waugh from Chandapol's long hop, the West Indies had taken 3 wickets for 46, but it was to be their one and only period of relief in the entire match. Blewett and Bevan then put on 165 for the 6th wicket, and Blewett was within 1 of repeating his 100 on debut against England on this, his home ground, 2 seasons earlier, when Cuffey bowled him with the last ball of a superb over. The left-handed Bevan was also denied his century, running out of partners at 85, but his influence on the outcome of the match was still not complete. After McGrath dispatched the hapless Griffith, Bevan and Warne ran through the West Indies batting in spite of Lara's first substantial innings of the series. Taylor snared Chandapol and Campbell at slip off Bevan, and after Lara and Hooper stylishly put on 96, the spinners claimed 3 wickets at the end of the third day to effectively seal the outcome. Lara was 65 at the end of the day, stroking the ball fluently after a careful start, but he lasted only 25 minutes more before Warne claimed him for the second time in the match for 78 to Healy's neat catch. Bevan formalised things with the last 3 wickets for an innings return of 6 for 82 and the Man of the Match award, and Australia were celebrating the retention of the trophy well before the evening.
I enjoyed it as a captain. I enjoy variety. I like seeing a guy like Michael Bevan and Shane Warne bowl together. It's fun. I think it's good cricket. You bowl plenty of overs. There's plenty of happening. There's some good shots. There's some good deliveries, and you see the occasional good catch. So I think it's good cricket. And from a captain's point of view, it just gives you that variety when things aren't going well. You can take your McGraths off and give your Warnes or your Bevans a go.
The teams arrived for the 5th and final test in Perth 2 days later to be greeted by stifling 40-degree heat and a pitch at the Wacker worryingly marked with snaking fault lines that showed signs of under-preparation. The West Indies welcomed back Ambrose on the ground where he had taken 17 wickets in his previous 2 tests, including his sensational 7-for-1 spell 4 years earlier, and it took the tall Antiguan only 3 balls to make his mark, Hayden edging a catch to first slip. The luckless Taylor was run out by Chandapol's slick work from cover. Blewett fell to Phil Simmons, one of the 2 West Indian tour replacements brought in as the middle-order all-rounder, and Steve Waugh's wild slash at Ambrose presented a catch to the keeper, so that Australia were 49 for 4 before lunch after winning the toss. Mark Waugh, who passed 4,000 test runs on his way to 79, and Bevan steadied things with a stand of 120, but Ambrose struck with 3 quick wickets immediately after tea. Waugh was caught at slip, Healy was bowled off stump,
Got him! Oh, what a bowler. Knocked him over as clean as a whistle.
And rifle was taken by the juggling Simmons at second slip off the first ball he received. For the second successive test, Bevan was left stranded within sight of 100. This time unbeaten 87 after just 4 hours batting. On the hard, cracked surface, Australia's score of 243 was better than it looked. And on the second morning, the West Indies quickly lost Campbell to rifle and Chandapol to a hook off McGrath. Lara, however, was intent on atoning for his earlier failures. He spent 55 balls before lunch, carefully scoring 15, but once he was attuned to the bowling and the conditions, he began to gather his runs in more familiar style. He shepherded the less talented but no less determined Samuels through a partnership that was eventually worth 208, paying special attention to Warne.
Here he goes, that's his 100, magnificent shot, and a fitting way to bring up a very fine 100 for Brian Lara. His 8th Test century, his second against Australia.
When the leg spinner was belatedly introduced for a second spell, Lara took 26 from 14 balls off him, including a huge 6, but Warne had the last laugh, inducing a catch to Healy from a wide delivery. On such a bouncy surface, Lara said his 132 proved to some doubters that he was more than what he himself termed a flat wicket maestro. Samuels soon followed Lara for a dogged 76 that spanned 5.5 hours. By this time, relations between the teams had become testy. During his stand with Samuels, Lara had intervened with a protest to umpire Darrell Hare for what he later called unnecessary and uncalled for Australian verbal abuse, or sledging, of Samuels. When Walsh batted at the end of the West Indies innings on the third morning, he carried Lara as a runner, a choice that the Australians believed to be deliberate provocation, and there were further words exchanged on the field when Lara collided with Hayden while sprinting a quick single. Sensing an explosive situation, umpires Hare and Peter Willey intervened, calling together Walsh and Taylor and advising them to get their charges to calm down. The captains shook hands on it, but afterwards, Taylor told the press that Lara was an antagonist. When Australia batted a second time, Ambrose quickly accounted for Taylor, caught by the keeper for 1, and Blewett bowled first ball by an out-and-out ground-eater. But a strained thigh muscle obliged him to leave the field after 4 overs, prompting one of Test cricket's most courageous performances. Walsh's hamstring had been under intense ice and magnetic field treatment for 2 days, and the doctor advised 8 days rest. But with Ambrose absent, the West Indies captain defied medical opinion in the interest of his team. Reducing his run to Sunday League length, but losing little of his space and movement, Walsh harassed the Australian batsmen, who were unsettled by both his bowling and an untrustworthy pitch. Walsh's 5 victims were a handy collection. The Waugh twins, Mark, spectacularly caught by Brown off a brute of a ball, and Steve taken low down at second slip for a duck, Bevan caught at third slip, Rifle at short leg, and Healy at extra cover. Top scorer Hayden fell to Hooper for 49, padding away the arm ball, and when Healy was 8th out, an innings loss seemed likely. There then followed a bizarre session of play, as Ambrose, returning to the field, completely lost control of his front foot and his senses, delivering 6 no balls in 1 over and 9, mainly from round the wicket, in another that would almost certainly be his last over in Australia. The upshot was that Bickle and Warne collected cheap runs at the end, and the West Indies were left 53 to formalise their victory, a target achieved in a volley of a dozen blazing boundaries, and Samuels, taunted by the Australians as a loser throughout the first innings, left the field as a winner. Overall, however, the Australians were the better team, confirming the superiority they had established in the Caribbean in 1995, and it was Mark Taylor who stepped forward once more to collect the Frank World Trophy. The Australians were better balanced and better disciplined, and didn't have to rely too heavily on too few players as the West Indies did, especially in the cases of Ambrose and Lara. It was significant that Ambrose and Lara had a negligible influence on the first 2 tests that the West Indies lost, and that Ambrose was absent from the decisive 4th when they were beaten by an innings and 183 runs, their biggest defeat in something like 40 years. Yet Ambrose was man of the match in the 2 tests they won, and Lara's belated 100 proved just as crucial as Ambrose's 7 wickets in the Perth victory. By contrast, Bevan and Blewett had outstanding series for Australia, for whom Hayden was the only specialist batsman with 100. None of the 3 had a settled place in the team prior to the series. The most telling individual contribution to the outcome was that of McGrath, the ever-probing Australian fast bowler, who snuffed out the danger of Lara by dismissing him 5 successive times in the first 3 tests, and whose 26 wickets earned him the Man of the Series award. Both teams would be pitched directly into another series. The West Indies were returning home to play India, and Australia were journeying to South Africa. They would be challenging contests for both.